The jungle of Guyana was quiet in the early mornings. Mist drifted slowly between the trees, and the distant calls of birds echoed through the humid air. In the clearing deep within that jungle stood a settlement of wooden buildings and narrow dirt paths. A faded wooden sign near the entrance read one word in red paint: Jonestown. To those who lived there, it had once been promised as paradise, but by November of 1978, the place had become something else entirely. Far away in the United States, many families had begun to worry about their loved ones who had disappeared into the jungle community run by a charismatic preacher named Jim Jones. They had written letters to government officials claiming that their relatives were being held against their will. One of the people who listened to those concerns was Congressman Leo Ryan, a determined and curious politician from California. Ryan was known for personally investigating issues rather than relying on second-hand reports. When he heard the growing number of complaints about the People's Temple and its mysterious agricultural project in Guyana, he decided to see the place himself. Ryan organized a small delegation of journalists, government aides, and concerned relatives. In November 1978, they boarded a plane and traveled thousands of miles south to the small South American country of Guyana. After landing in the capital city of Georgetown, the group prepared to travel to the remote settlement that had become the center of so many rumors. The jungle flight to Jonestown was long and unsettling. The aircraft buzzed over endless green forests, rivers twisting through the landscape like dark snakes. When they finally reached the small airstrip near the settlement, the group was greeted by members of the People's Temple. They seemed polite, even cheerful, but something about their smiles felt rehearsed. Jonestown itself appeared strange at first glance. Rows of wooden cabins stood along muddy paths. Loudspeakers hung from poles around the compound. Large signs painted with slogans about socialism and unity decorated the buildings. The settlement housed nearly 1,000 people. Most were Americans. When the delegation arrived, the residents gathered to welcome them. Music played, children sang, and Jim Jones himself appeared before the visitors. Jones was not the energetic preacher he had once been in California. He looked tired, pale, and sick. His dark sunglasses hid his eyes even in the dim light beneath the pavilion roof. But when he spoke, his voice carried authority. He told the visitors that Jonestown was a peaceful community where people had escaped racism, capitalism, and injustice in America. According to Jones, they had built a new society where everyone worked together and shared everything. The visitors watched carefully. At first, everything seemed calm. People farmed the land, children attended school, and meals were shared in the communal dining hall. But as the hours passed, the delegation began to notice small details that felt unsettling. Armed guards stood around the edges of the compound. Residents seemed nervous whenever they spoke to outsiders, and the loudspeakers never stopped broadcasting Jim Jones' voice. His speeches played day and night. Sometimes they lasted for hours. Late that evening, the visitors attended a large gathering in the central pavilion. Hundreds of residents sat on wooden benches while Jones addressed the crowd from a chair. He spoke about enemies who wanted to destroy their community. He warned them about government conspiracies and traitors. The atmosphere felt tense. Some residents applauded loudly after every sentence. Others stared silently at the floor. During the meeting, one of the journalists noticed a man quietly slip a piece of paper to a member of the delegation. The note was small, folded tightly. When they opened it later, the message inside was simple: "Please help us get out." More notes followed. Several residents approached the visitors secretly, whispering that they wanted to leave Jonestown. They said their passports had been taken away. They said armed guards watched them constantly. Most of all, they said they were afraid of Jim Jones. Word of these requests eventually reached Jones himself. His friendly demeanor began to crack. He looked exhausted and paranoid. His voice shook as he insisted that anyone who wanted to leave was free to do so. But the tension in the air suggested otherwise. The following morning, a small group of residents announced that they wanted to leave Jonestown with Congressman Ryan's delegation. It was a dangerous decision. Many of them feared retaliation, but they were desperate. Ryan agreed to take them out. The group prepared to depart the settlement and travel to a nearby airstrip called Port Kaituma, where their planes waited. At first, the departure seemed peaceful. Tractors carried the visitors and defectors down the muddy road toward the airstrip, but back in Jonestown, Jim Jones was unraveling. Inside the pavilion, he ranted to his closest followers about betrayal and enemies. He believed the community would soon be destroyed by the American government. To Jones, there was only one solution. No one would leave. When the group reached the Port Kaituma airstrip, they began boarding two small aircraft. The tropical sun hung low in the sky as the engines prepared to start. Suddenly, a tractor pulling a trailer approached the runway. Several armed men jumped down from the vehicle. They carried rifles and shotguns. For a moment, everything went silent. Then the shooting began. Bullets tore through the air. Congressman Leo Ryan fell first, struck multiple times before collapsing onto the ground. Journalists and defectors ran for cover behind the aircraft, but the attackers kept firing. Cameras and notebooks dropped into the dirt as people scrambled for safety. Within minutes, 5 people lay dead. Others were severely wounded. The attackers quickly fled back toward Jonestown. The survivors were left stunned on the runway, surrounded by silence and blood. Back at the settlement, Jim Jones gathered the entire community beneath the pavilion. Night had fallen. The loudspeakers crackled as Jones spoke into the microphone. His voice sounded calm, almost gentle, but the words he spoke carried unimaginable horror. He told the crowd that the congressman was dead. He said American soldiers would soon arrive to destroy their community. He claimed that their enemies would torture their children and imprison them all. The only dignified choice, he said, was something he called revolutionary suicide. At first, some people in the crowd protested. They cried and begged for another solution, but Jones refused. Large metal containers were brought forward. Inside them was a purple-colored drink mixed with cyanide and sedatives. Guards with rifles surrounded the pavilion. Jones ordered the children to come forward first. Parents were instructed to feed the poison to their sons and daughters. The cries of terrified children filled the night. Some mothers hesitated, some screamed, but the armed guards made resistance impossible. Doctors and nurses moved through the crowd with syringes. They injected poison into infants. Children collapsed one by one. The adults were next. Jones told them that death was simply stepping into another place, a peaceful escape from the cruel world outside. Some followers believed him. Others drank because they felt they had no choice. Within minutes, people began collapsing across the pavilion floor. Bodies fell against each other. The jungle echoed with screams and confusion. Parents held their children as the poison took effect. Some tried to run, but armed guards stopped them. The night grew quieter as more and more people died. By the time the terrible event ended, over 900 people were dead. Hundreds were children. The following day, Authorities in Guyana received reports of the mass deaths. Soldiers and officials traveled by helicopter to the remote settlement. When they arrived, they found one of the most horrifying scenes in modern history. Bodies covered the ground around the pavilion. Many lay face down in the dirt. Others were piled together where they had collapsed. Children were scattered among the adults. The silence was overwhelming. Investigators moved slowly through the compound, counting the dead. They eventually found Jim Jones lying near his chair. He had a gunshot wound to the head. Whether he had taken his own life or been killed by someone else remained uncertain. News of the tragedy spread quickly around the world. In the United States, families watched television reports in disbelief. Entire families had vanished in a single night. Parents, children, grandparents. Nearly 1,000 lives lost in a remote jungle settlement. The event became known as the Jonestown Massacre. It was one of the largest mass deaths of American civilians in history. Investigations later revealed the terrifying control Jim Jones had exercised over his followers. For years, he had used fear, manipulation, and isolation to dominate the community. Residents were forced to attend long meetings where Jones tested their loyalty. Sometimes he staged rehearsals for mass suicide, calling them white nights. During these drills, members believed they were drinking poison. Only later were they told it had been a test. The psychological pressure was immense. Many followers had once believed they were building a better world. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare deep in the jungle. The tragedy of Jonestown changed how governments and psychologists studied cults and mind control. Experts began researching how charismatic leaders could manipulate groups of people so completely. They examined the power of isolation, propaganda, and fear. But for the families of the victims, the questions never truly ended. How could so many people have been led to such a horrifying fate? Why did no one stop it sooner? Even decades later, the story of Jonestown remains one of the darkest chapters in modern history. The jungle eventually reclaimed the abandoned settlement. The wooden buildings collapsed. The paths disappeared beneath vegetation. Today, only fragments remain where the community once stood. But the echoes of that night in November 1978 still haunt history. A place that had once promised hope became a symbol of tragedy, and the name Jonestown became forever associated with one of the most chilling events the world has ever known.